Hello, Professor Thomas Baumert. Here I am, I'm Marcos Estebaranz, and I will be presenting to you the work, second call individual work, on how sport has been influenced by sociology and how sociology has influenced on sports. The sports context, since the appearance of what we already know as sports right now, like basketball, football, and all that. I must say that I will be applying probably most of the theories and contexts I use to football, because it's one topic I'm very familiar with, and it's obviously the sport, the most relevant sport out there, seeing with an audience from all over the world. And I have actually done this semester a scientific study, literature review on brands that sponsor in football, and I've done like a research of the development since the 90s to now, and how the brands have evolved, and many of that has to do with sociology, because many of the changes have been focused on the customers and the audience that sees the game. Here is the index. As you can see, I in the PowerPoint I put first the introduction with early sport context. I would classify the study of this development in two basic factors, which is brands and the audience that actually watches these sports, because the audience is one of the most influential parts and is part of the sociology. Then I'll be talking on sponsorship, because it's part of the brand's action on sports to relate with the audience that is watching the football, and is relating what sponsors sponsor what team. And for instance, Fly Emirates, as a high class brand, will never be sponsoring a club as Leganés. They would be going for Real Madrid. And not so much for selling purposes, but for giving the audience the awareness that Fly Emirates is one high class brand and is related to Real Madrid as a high class team. Then we'll go with the impact of globalization and the digital era, and the future developments. In the first step, I'll be showing the introduction, showing the early sport context inside sociology. As we know, back in the days where current sports that we might know nowadays, such as football, basketball, etc., at the beginning they were like minor sports nowadays that have barely repercussion further than at the local place where they would play. As knowing that the audience would be really limited to the local region, and maybe people who were fans of watching the sport itself rather than the fan of a club. Since the development of this, the audience has been growing, and that has changed, it has evolved. But back then, even in the 60s and 80s, players were not so much recognized, apart from the really talented ones that many people wanted to watch, but the rest were rather irrelevant. They didn't have as much repercussion. They wouldn't have like an international career that would depend on maybe an English team or a Germany team signing them, or maybe going to some other good leagues to try out. That was something that no one would think about. Players in teams where if the Atletico de Madrid was from Madrid, all players were from Madrid. It's not like today. Atletico has barely 5-6 Spanish players, and not even all of them are from Madrid. So that has changed a lot, not only in Atletico, but also in the rest of the European clubs especially. Also, there was a clear limitation with international players, even though there was leagues, important leagues such as the Brazilian ones back in the days, that could even be at the level of European leagues. But right now, with the current development of Europe, bringing in many talented players, that has changed. In the second case, we'll be talking about the sponsorship. The sponsorship as a concept was introduced by local brands that were willing to support the local team. Because of the repercussion back in the days, there was not many repercussion for brands to sponsor a team. And actually, even though we have the sponsors really commonly in our days, it is brandly new, as the first sponsor was in 1976 by Kering Tires in the Kering Town team. So it was a local team being sponsored by a local brand with selling purposes. right now, with the increasing of the audience, these brand purposes are changing with the new approaches that are focusing on brand awareness and perception of the audience, like we'll be talking right now with the globalization and digitalization era. And now I'll go more in depth into the impact of globalization and the digital era. So as I mentioned, sponsorship have evolved from their first conception as they were born to a new one that has changed, and mainly because of this. The globalization and the new digitalization era, with all the technologies that can be applied to any business, but football obviously as an increasing audience sport, it has taken advantage out of it even more than other businesses. I said globalization, what has done is to be able to get everyone to know what happens all over the world, and sports is not an exception. Football fans are all over the world. As I said, it's an international language that everyone can see and understand. That's why it attracts many people, and brands have been aware of this. Creating new business models based on maybe other new business models that just came out, such as platforms as Netflix and HBO. And with sports, there is currently a brand new created DAZN platform that has the same similarity with Netflix, but just offering online streaming sports. That is a clear way of getting to the audience, because anyone having a Wi-Fi sport or data access, they will be able to watch a game all over the world, wherever they are. And that has a huge impact on the perception of the football itself, because it's watched everywhere. Brands that are sponsoring are exposed also to the audience, and even if brands have to be careful when sponsoring, because actually sponsoring the wrong team belonging to a culture that might disagree with some of the values of the company might actually create some problems. For instance, we have the case of Qatar Airways in Barcelona that didn't really get a really good welcome when they signed the contract, and they were really willing to change the sponsorship after the contract, because the fans really did not want a Qatar sponsorship on their team. So brands really have to take more of that into account, because the digital era and the globalization has exposed to a really sensationalist audience that can be offended really quickly. So brands have to take that into account in order not to get negative outcomes. And just to finish, a quick recap of what the future development of the sports sector would be. Is easy to understand that everything that I applied now to football won't change to other sport, because it doesn't change due to the rules of the game itself, but to the audience, to the people that watch it, to the society that has access to it. So the future development of the sector, I see it right now as it is starting to develop. Many platforms will be trying not only to offer football as a streaming sport, but probably trying to get platforms such as DAZN that recap all the sports that can be actually watched and followed, which will probably increase a lot their audience, and they will probably have to focus their product on the audience that wants to watch those sports. Also, another change that probably was really influential from society is a really recent one, that is in the La Liga, the VAR. Which is basically a way to try to get justice so that polemics are not as conflictive as before. So probably society and sociology had to do a lot with that, because we had been for a lot of years calling Barcelona, Real Madrid, or the referees that was robbing or whatever. The VAR is probably not working as well as they would want to, but is willing to achieve that justice, that audience will never be angry about a game. And it's really hard to achieve, but I mean, it's a step in the right direction that is probably being taken, and I think that is where the sector is going to.